We'll this works. We'll get going here, and I've tried to organize these. I can't claim to have a logical order to them, but I have tried to put them at least sequentially so that they're divided more or less equally. But we'll start off, I think, with a good conceptual question that's actually directed to both speakers. And if you both want to take a place at the podia, is that the plural of podium? Podia? It should be, shouldn't it?
It is for tonight.
It is tonight.
Yes.
Enjoy your podia, ladies and gentlemen. How would the speakers define discrimination? And does it differ in this context from other kinds of discrimination?
I'll let you go first.
Okay. No, it doesn't. Discrimination is an intentional action to act for a prohibited reason. That is, if I make a decision about my relationship or my service to you based upon a reason which is unlawful or irrelevant to our relationship. For example, your race, your ethnicity, that is unlawful discrimination. I should say, more broadly, of course, discrimination just means discernment, as I said in my opening talk. So I'm assuming we're talking about unlawful discrimination here. So unlawful discrimination is acting on the basis of a prohibited reason. That doesn't mean that anything I do which has the effect of making someone feel offended or has the result of having a disparate impact is discrimination. It's not. Properly understood, discrimination is unjust precisely insofar as the discriminating person acts for a reason which is not connected to the purpose for the action.
And I would define discrimination relatively similarly in the idea that one might act differently towards a person when looking at a set of standard actions. Say, so a landlord renting out apartments. If you meet all the basic requirements for renting that apartment and yet you're turned away because of your family status as a single mother, that action would be discrimination. It is moving beyond an accepted standard of actions to withhold or privilege a person or a class of persons.
And I think with any of these, if we'd like any further discussion, that seems perfectly appropriate. And I've got this microphone that seems to be the loudest one, so I think if that's what I think, that's what we're going to do.
Okay.
So do either of you want to follow up on any of that then before we move on?
Yeah, no, I would actually. I'm glad that we agree on the definition of discrimination. That definition of discrimination is completely incompatible with the cases that sexual identity groups have brought against people like Baronelle Stutzman and Elaine Huguenin. The evidence is uncontroverted in those cases that these religious business owners are not acting because of the person's sexual orientation. The record is clear that these people not only were willing to serve, but were in fact knowingly serving same-sex attracted persons, people who did not share their religious convictions. They drew the line at being compelled to do something that they understood to be a false action, a false statement. Now, the effect of that was felt disproportionately by same-sex attracted persons, and on that basis, the high courts of New Mexico and Washington said that they could be driven out of the public square. They could be deprived of their businesses, deprived of their personal assets. That's inconsistent with the definition of discrimination on which we both agree.
Well, and I would add that when you write a law in response to a Supreme Court decision extending marriage equality nationwide, in order to then create a caveat where now legally married couples don't have access to institutions that other married couples have equal access to, that could also be a case of discrimination.
This may be a good follow-up question then for Eva. Could Eva share specific examples where religious freedom laws have actually hurt persons and were a misuse of such laws?
I can't share specific examples in this context. I mean, I'm speaking at this moment for my personal self and not necessarily for the organizational voice. But I would say that when you look at the way that religious freedom laws impact people's everyday lives, listen to the stories that you're hearing. Listen to the examples when people are turned away from job opportunities. Listen to the examples when people are denied access to spouses' bedsides and emergency room scenarios, and therefore denied most intimate moments of shared experience. I think those are some examples that if you're listening, you'll hear in the public sphere.
And on the same card, a question for Adam. You talked about a loving God, but isn't the idea of refusing an LGBT person access to a dying spouse on religiously grounded reasons, isn't that incompatible with the idea that God is a perfectly loving being?
Yeah. Well, if that were the case, that would be unloving, but that's not what's happening. First of all, there are private law devices to solve these problems. There are powers of attorney. There are ways to designate someone outside of redefining the institution of marriage for everyone, coercing the entire society to adopt your understanding of what that institution is. And in fact, there are targeted legislative proposals that were proffered in California, Connecticut, Colorado, other places to create civil unions and domestic partnership institutions. Their side rejected those proposals. What they wanted, they were not happy actually with visitation rights or access or any of these other benefits that we've heard about tonight. They rejected those proposals. In fact, in California, they challenged the domestic partnership law in court and got it declared unconstitutional. What they wanted was the word marriage. Why? Because with the word marriage, they can coerce all of society with the coercive aspects of public law to state that marriage is something other than the union of a man and a woman. That's what they're after, and that's what they've got. And now they're using that as a weapon against religious liberty people. And again, not they, not her. I wish more people in her movement were like Eva. She's defying the stereotype this evening, for which I'm grateful.
Yeah, I would add, the situations we're discussing where persons are turned away from bedside access is a scenario where a person comes into an emergency room with power of attorney letters, with a marriage license, and because the institution, the medical institution, is a religious institution, they can choose to define marriage within their own terms in that emergency room and ignore the legal rights included in a marriage certificate or power of attorney pieces of documentation, which has happened whether or not it is right.
That's just not, that's a false statement of the law. The law says they are permitted to act on the basis of a conviction that man is a man and a woman. So if you have a power of attorney, then you have a valid right to be there whether or not you're married. It's actually irrelevant to the question.
But what it looks like on the front end is that when frontline staff don't understand how the policies work, people are turned away.
I agree. That's a problem that staff at hospitals need to be better educated about the law. But that's not a problem, and that's not a failure of religious liberty laws.
This is another question. I suppose this is directed to Adam. Wouldn't the First Amendment render any additional religious liberty laws redundant and pointless?
It would if all 3 branches of the federal government and all 150 branches of the state governments agreed on what it means. So this is the problem I identified in my opening talk, is that you basically have 153 different interpretations of what the First Amendment means. And as I gave a very, very short primer, we could go into this at great length if people were interested. Some of those are radically incompatible understandings of what the First Amendment means. So what we end up with is a conversation that sometimes looks like a dispute. In fact, it sometimes is a dispute between, say, Congress and the Supreme Court, or between the executive and the Supreme Court, or between Congress and the executive over the meaning of the First Amendment. And look, these are not new conversations. What's new is the loss of the shared understanding of the source of these rights. That is new. That's come about only in the last few decades. Incorporation is new. Incorporation against the states. That's only a few decades old as well. But the conversations amongst the 3 branches of the federal government, we've had that since the founding.
Eva, did you want to follow that up?
I am not a member of the legal department, and so I will refrain.
Well, the next question is for you. Please explain how the freedom to act can ever be separated from the freedom to believe.
Well, this is quite a philosophical question, and you are a philosophy professor.
It warmed the very cockles of my heart.
And I did not take a single philosophy course in college. But what I would say is that I carry many beliefs that might contradict with institutions I interact with persons I interact with. But ultimately, my actions come down to what I believe to be the most valuable in that moment and the most respectful toward the persons I'm interacting with. And so I think the freedom to believe, no one can tell me what to believe. No one can tell me the way that that belief should inform how I look at the world, how I interpret the world, how I see myself in the world. But when there is a clause in front of me that says, listen, here is the way we're going to act on this if I agree to that institution, if my personal belief is different and yet I've agreed to that institution, then I have to make a choice whether or not the belief and the act work. And there's probably a way that he's going to spin that for his side too. So,
Is there?
No, I mean, look, the distinction between action and belief is again not new to law. What law does, public law, and this is an important actually point to make, I think. What public law does is prohibit culpable actions which cause discernible harm to the community. That's the job of public law. On this we agree. But what matters actually is how you define culpability. There are all sorts of actions which every day cause externalities, as economists and legal philosophers call them, effects on other people. But we don't punish people for doing things that other people find offensive or other people find convenient. We punish people when they act with a wrong intention toward another human being. That's the job of public law. It's not to prohibit conduct that we just disagree with. That's not the job of public law. Private law is actually much more nuanced, and it's actually much better able to handle some of these differences. If the Supreme Court in Obergefell had been content to leave these questions up to state law, this all could have been worked out. These disparate cases, these disparate problems that require resolution could have been worked out by using existing legal resources. I mentioned powers of attorney. You could do estate plans. You can have targeted state legislation granting particular rights which are needed for same-sex couples, all without forcing religious institutions and religious businesses and religious individuals to communicate what they understand to be a falsehood about the nature of the human person.
Also a question for Adam. You made some very explicitly Christian claims toward the end of your second speech. Do you think that undermines your argument for those of us who are not Christians?
Yeah, great question. No, I don't think it does because, excuse me, religion is a good not just for its instrumental benefits, but I would argue that it's good in and of itself. So when I give talks like this, places outside the South, I tend to emphasize that aspect of the argument. We're in the Bible Belt, so I gave a sort of more Christianized version of the argument. But I can just lay it out very briefly. The argument is that, that among the goods, things that are good for human beings to pursue, life, health, knowledge, beauty, virtue itself, is the good of religion. That even someone who is mistaken in their religious beliefs, just by pursuing religious knowledge, just by pursuing a relationship with some source of meaning, is actually improving themselves, is actually flourishing in a way that is good for them and for the members of their community. In other words, a religious person is better off than a non-religious person, and a religious society is better off than an irreligious society. Now, is this empirically provable? No. None of the basic human goods are empirically provable. So how do we know? Well, we can judge them by their fruits. So this is the argument I opened with. You can tell genuinely religious people, people who are pursuing the good of religion, however they pursue that, by the fruits of their conduct. And in societies that tend to liberate people to act in pursuit of the good of religion, you see all these other goods come about. That's not the reason why religion is good, but it's evidence or points to the goodness of religion qua religion. So in short, you don't have to be a Christian to accept the argument that people are better off when they're free to pursue religious goods.
One of my, as an Episcopalian, one of my favorite songs we sing at camp says, "May the work that I've done speak for me. May the truth that I've told speak for me. May the love that I share." And I think that's ultimately what you're saying here, is that you will recognize what your language was, genuinely religious person by the fruits of who they are. Mm-hmm. I would contend that many LGBTQ persons are those kind of people, And that as we expand our understanding of how LGBTQ persons interact with religion, we might also look more carefully at how religious institutions do have different policies on marriage, on whatever the other contentious issues are, but that, we recognize all these different religious persons involved in movements and in social justice activism. And I have to tell you that my work is so much grounded in my religious faith and my belief, and the home I was raised in, the community I was raised in Mobile, and that I would not be doing this work had my mother not told me that she gave me her blessing, because that was a huge part of my fear as a person who had been told that I was an abomination before a God that I believed loved me.
The next card is actually going to ask you to elaborate on the very thing you were just saying. You stated that you're a person of faith. How does your faith or your belief inform your position? If you'd say more.
So when I came out to myself, I was 17. That weekend, my younger sister, who's 11 years younger than me, got baptized. And my dad is Baptist minister. So when you're baptized in the Baptist church, you receive the whole congregation afterward. And I remember that morning waking up and turning in my teen study Bible. This was 2002 or 3. And turned to the thing on what does the Bible say about, and at the time it was just homosexuality. And I turned and I read the scriptures. I just wept. I wept. Because my entire life had been the church. The lens through which I saw myself, the lens through which I saw the world was the church. And now I realized I was incongruent with that world, and yet this was the most real and natural understanding of myself I had ever known. And so that day in the line, the receiving line, I remember looking at all the people who came by thinking, would you shake my hand if you knew what I know about myself now? Would you call me your adopted granddaughter? Would you even give me a hug? Because I had internalized that I was worthless. And so many religious people have that understanding when they grow up in communities of faith that say that LGBTQ persons do not have the same value as other persons in the eyes of God. What I can say is that over the last 12, 13 years, my work has been about trying to find ways to bridge those conversations, to sit down with folks, to say, listen, here's my story and I'd like to hear yours. But for me, what it ultimately came down to was this. Was it more bearing false witness, to lie, to be celibate but miserable, or to marry someone whom I knew I could never love the way they would deserve? Would it be bearing false witness to enter that miscovenant, knowing full well who I was? And ultimately what I decided is I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, I have a lot of questions, but it was more faithful to who I had been created to be, to live in covenant and monogamy with a person with whom I share life. And that is my bottom line. I try and see the holiness and the godliness in all persons, and I think that our internal, intimate relationships are the times that we see holiness most recognized and visible, and I see that in my spouse.
Adam, do you want to comment on any of that?
Yeah, I do want to affirm at least two of the things I just heard, and that one is that people who are same-sex attracted are many of them have sincere religious convictions. I have very good friends who are same-sex attracted, who have very sincere religious convictions. And the second thing I want to say is it is a tragedy that any institution which calls itself Christian would communicate the message that anyone, no matter their sexual orientation, is worthless. So I'll just leave it at that.
Getting a little bit more philosophical now. Is freedom of religion a natural right? And if so, this is directed to both of you, by the way. If it is a natural right, the freedom of religion, then does our positive law that enshrines the freedom of religion become redundant? Is it pointless?
This is your field.
Yes, no. Should I be more specific?
that works
Yes,
for me.
it is a natural right. As I argued earlier, freedom of religion, because it is a liberty to act upon or in pursuit of the good of religious exercise, is something that is endowed in our nature, in the words of the Declaration. Positive laws protecting that right are not redundant or superfluous for at least two reasons. One is there are tyrants in the world who would deprive us of that liberty. And sometimes laws can stand up to thugs and tyrants. The second reason is it requires specification. Some of these are very hard questions, as I think we've seen tonight. And one of the roles of positive law, one of the important roles of positive law, is to work out nuanced and carefully detailed solutions when different liberties and different rights come into conflict. Of course, that requires, however, that we be allowed to have the conversations like we're having here. That's exactly the conversation, unfortunately, which the Supreme Court has done its best to shut down in Obergefell versus Hodges. End the conversation. We now have one national policy on this question, and now people are no longer going to be free to debate these through their democratic and legislative institutions. That's hugely problematic, and it generates all these other problems that we've been discussing this evening.
I would add that the positive law, the freedom of religion, is critical because it also provides the freedom not to have a belief system. And that is essential, that religious right to not believe is protected, or to believe something that isn't considered the standard religious faith or mainline denominations or belief traditions. I would also add that when you look at human history, without a doubt, I mean, that is a natural part of the way that humans have developed, that we are looking for the divine, and we are looking for our reason for being here. And then many times religion becomes our understanding of that exact question.
Eva, you're getting bonus points for continuing to anticipate what's on the next card.
Nobody gave me the questions.
This again
Not even
directed.
Politico, CNN.
Sorry, this seems strangely familiar. The directed to both of you.
China.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a great night. Directed to both of you, since you've both made it clear that you are people of sincere religious faith, someone in the audience asks, what are conscientious atheists who care about freedom and civil rights supposed to do in light of this discussion?
Ooh. Can you say that again?
What are conscientious atheists who care about freedom and civil rights supposed to do in light of this discussion?
I mean, number one, research. Read, understand the nuance, understand the different organizations coming into the conversation, pay attention to the way that media coverage might actually be changing what the actual conversation is, and in your own discernment, best find a path to stand by whatever humanist or fairness-minded tradition is your own.
I would say that the conscientious atheist is probably unlikely to find very persuasive my argument for religious liberty grounded in the Christian story. But I think the conscientious atheist should find persuasive the earlier argument that I made for religious liberty, which is grounded in the good of religion. Even if you don't participate in that good yourself, I think if you're a conscientious atheist, you should want other people to be free to pursue it. And part of that is just a liberty story, that conscientious atheists should support liberty, period, full stop. Part of it is for all the fruits that one gets in a society that liberates conscience and religious liberty, in the story that I told earlier.
A question to Eva. Adam raised several concerns about marriage and its relationship to biological children. In particular, used the language of children having a right to their own biological parents. How do you respond to that and other concerns related to adoption from your point of view?
Oh, it was a case where he was not discriminating against me nor my family with the things he was saying, but they are difficult to hear. I would say that when you look at same-sex persons, whether individual or couples, or in terms of relationships, particularly transgender persons who are in marriages that actually are heterosexual because of the nature of gender identity and expression, that what you'll see is the number one concern is always the welfare of children. It's always the welfare of children. And as we look at these foster and adoption bills, the thing that makes me nuts is that the House passed the HB 24 bill on pro-life day. The same day that the House passed a constitutional amendment eliminating a woman's right to choose should Roe versus Wade be overturned. And it is such conscious dissonance to pass a law that eliminates a woman's right to choose while at the same time passing a law that eliminates a pool of candidates who might be foster and adoptive parents for children who end up in the system. Right now we have more than 5,000 children in our foster and adoptive system in Alabama with more than 1,000 waiting homes. LGBTQ couples are more than adequate families for these children. LGBTQ couples are 4 times more likely than heterosexual couples to be raising adopted children and 6 times more likely to be raising foster children. And if these couples can provide these young people with stability, with love, with the message that they have value and that they belong somewhere, that is more valuable to those children than whether there is a male or female in the room, or both, especially because they've already experienced the trauma of being removed from their biological parents under whatever the circumstances were. And I honestly just, it's a difficult conversation because I know that my family, we actually just completed our foster parent certification in Jefferson County, and we're a great house, and we're gonna have a lot of fun.
Yeah, so, I mean, the argument that I was alluding to, that I certainly didn't have time to make it in the opening statement, is simply this, that once you require all states to redefine marriage so that it no longer involves inherently and necessarily the union of a man and a woman, or put differently, using the second line of Kennedy's opinion in Obergefell, if the project is to make same-sex unions and marriage exactly the same in law, the only way to achieve that is to eliminate all the legal incidents of marriage which connect children to their biological parents. You can't do it otherwise. Now, this is not a problem created by the innovation of same-sex marriage. It's a problem that actually really accelerates in the no-fault divorce revolution in the 1970s. There's another whole story to tell there. But what we've seen since Obergefell is exactly what many of us predicted before Obergefell, which is the logical entailment of redefining marriage is that children are now, as a matter of principle, as a matter of logical entailment, no longer secured to mother and father in law. It's a happenstance. Are you born into a family where your mother and father happen to be married to each other? You struck the lottery. If you're not, now your relations to your parents are defined by the choices of the adults with whom you happen to live. This is problematic because every child has a mother and a father. And part of our identity is constituted by our choices, but a large part of our identity is constituted by the genes given to us, our biology given to us by mother and father. And so we now are raising whole generations who don't know at least one parent. You just think about one example of this, the birth certificate. If we're now going to make same-sex couples exactly equal to marriage in law, then they have to have the right, she has to have the right, if she's going to adopt a child, to have the original birth certificate reflect her and her spouse on the birth certificate. But the problem is, if that's going to be our policy, if we're now going to eliminate one of the biological parents, what happens when that child grows up and wants to know whether he has any genetic disorders, his medical history? There's much of our identity that's constituted by the biological reality that each and every one of us actually has a mother and a father. Are we going to deprive children of that right? And I argue that we shouldn't.
Can I interject?
Please, yes.
I would also add that children who are being adopted or who are in foster care are in such trauma and crisis situations because of instances of neglect, abuse, or violence within the home, drug use within the home. In many of those cases, the paternal father is not in the picture. Most times it is the mother who is keeping the family together and who is trying to get their children back. I absolutely, and listen, I'm a genealogy nerd. I care about my family history to the nth degree. And one of the things that I really struggle with is how to help children know their story, how to help them ground themselves in who they are and how they got here. And one of the commitments that I make and that any foster adoptive parent makes when they go into the Alabama system is that we will document that story as much as we have data to document in a life book that tells them who they are, who mom and dad are, who their story is. We are never going to tell them anything negative about their parents, but to help them see who they are in the most meaningful and worth-filled way possible. And that as a foster parent, I do not take that responsibility lightly. It breaks my heart that a 10-year-old kid doesn't have a picture of themselves as a baby. It breaks my heart that a 9-year-old kid has no idea what their story is. And so as an LGBTQ parent, whether or not my name's on a birth certificate, I'm going to make sure that kid knows who they are as much as I can. Not necessarily who they are with us, but who they are as an individual. It's like in Khalil Gibran's book, The Prophet, he says, your children are not your children. They are the sons and the daughters of life's longing for itself. We're all part of this reality of creation, and helping kids understand where they come from is not necessarily limited to who's on their birth certificate.
Well, looking at the time, we are nearly out of it. So if I could ask, I had intended to have us flip a coin earlier to see who would get the last word. We didn't do it. So let me propose that since we started off with Eva and then Adam, perhaps we can give Eva the last word in this round. So I'd like to ask each of our speakers to give a roughly 2 minutes closing statement, just sort of summarizing as you think through the back and forth bit of the debates and then also this question and answer period. What do you take to be the main issues? What would you like to have us thinking about as we leave here tonight?
Well, I would say that we actually didn't achieve nearly as much disagreement as I was expecting. I'm a little disappointed. I think I have many more disagreements with HRC National than I do with HRC Alabama, which is refreshing. I think with HRC National, I would say we disagree on every term in the proposition. I think we disagree about what religion is. I think we disagree about what liberty is. I think we, quoting the 42nd president, probably even disagree about what is. But I think what we've heard tonight is that Eva and I actually have quite a lot of agreement on many of these propositions. And I could wish that more who share her views and her advocacy on these issues were more like Eva. And I think we would all be better off. I would just conclude by saying religious liberty is important to be protected in law because religious exercise and moral conscience, fidelity to moral conscience, are good in and of themselves. In addition, a society that protects these things in law is going to benefit from that protection.
Thank you. Eva.
I also say I have enjoyed this. This has been my favorite kind of evening. I'm one of those nerds who would rather spend my time here than many other places. But I would also say that when we're having these conversations, we have to look at bottom line civil rights. LGBTQ persons across the country do not have access to some of the most fundamental civil rights, life, liberty, safety. And that if we're going to have larger conversations, we've got to get to a place where every single state in the United States provides that individuals not relating to their marriage status or anything like that have absolute equal access to civil rights under law. That's our main concern. Our work at HRC Alabama is to ensure that full legal equality. And when we can ensure full access to civil rights for LGBTQ persons, as I said earlier, I really believe our conversations on some of these issues may shift.
Thank you. Well, can I ask everyone to please thank our speakers tonight? Thank you both very much. Thank you all for being here. Apologies to anyone whose questions didn't get asked. I promise I had no agenda. If you would take a moment to complete that little survey card that's on your chair, you can set it on the table that's just outside those doors on your way out. Thank you so much for being here, and have a wonderful evening. Please continue this conversation as you leave.